I also think, I don't know whether this isn't exactly on the constitutional issue, but let me say this in addition. In my judgment, at the essence of participation in a deliberative body is your implied, if not express, commitment that when you argue and finally vote, if the vote doesn't go your way, you are obliged, nevertheless, to submit. From the beginning of American Presbyterianism, the brethren agreed that when a majority vote is passed, you either actively concur, passively submit, or if conscience will permit you to do neither, you peaceably withdraw. Now, that means that when, for example, we vote on a program, I have a right to argue against that program, but when the program passes, I have a duty to passively submit to that, and it means that with respect to the funding of that program, I have a duty to help fund it. That's part of what it means to be in submission to the brethren. It's part of what it means to be part of a deliberative assembly, that you're agreeing you're going to go with what the majority, unless it forces you to sin. If in some way or another continuing forces you to sin, then you can't do it. But it's very hard for me to imagine that that category applies to anything that we're talking about today. What all this means is that when we pass those budgets, when we approve those programs, we're implicitly saying that we are prepared to do our part. Now, the church that I have pastored, there were times when we had very stark disagreements with some of the policies of some of the denominational agencies. And we had the liberty and freedom to argue against them and try and do what we could to see them defeated. But when we weren't successful at that, what it means to be a Presbyterian, what it means finally to be a Christian means to be willing to submit to the brothers. And so we funded those agencies according to the askings all through the period where we weren't particularly happy with what they were doing. And we believed we were doing what was Christ-honoring and what was consistent with our commitment as Presbyterians. And I think that's the culture we have to try and create in the PCA, because, as I said, many of us were actually told when we came into the PCA something very different. You don't like the programs, don't pay for them. That's actually recommended. But you see, at the end here, we're talking about coercion. We want a culture where there's no coercion. But that's coercive. In other words, if I can't persuade you of my point of view, then what I'm going to do is coerce you to my point of view by using force. That is the force of purse strings, not paying for it. So in an odd way, those who are charging this program with being coercive and violating Chapter 25 themselves, generally speaking, adopt a policy that is coercive. And it's that culture that I think we have to try and undo and have a proper commitment to voluntary association and love and so on, but realizing that none of that undermines Christ's principle that a laborer is worthy of his hire, and if we're the recipient of benefits, we have a duty to pay for those benefits, and if we all are recipients, we have a duty to fairly share the payment of those benefits. Of course, helped me as a pastor. When I came into the PCA, I wanted to understand what this was all about, and so I made my way reading through the books of minutes. Now that seems, you know, I've actually been accused of reading the Book of Church Order devotionally, and I have to say there are parts in there that you could profit from reading devotionally. But the fact is, I wanted to understand the history, the sensibility of the denomination, and so the opportunity to read through the minutes and see what the church has done. Well, to be a repository of our memory, of our history, is a crucial work, and the AC is absolutely integral to that process. Of course, the assembly itself. This is our Lord's will, that we should have a body of elders come together and regularly deal with matters that have to do with the whole church. And apart from the labors of the AC committee, not only overall in pulling together the assembly, but in the incredible labor that goes on during that week of collating the labors and getting them into print and getting them before the body. Absolutely crucial. And in the New Testament, you know, the labor of the assembly was integral to the life of the churches, and that's why they sent folk out to explain what had been done at that assembly in Acts. And from the beginning of the churches that I've been involved in, the work of the higher courts has always been an integral part of the way we've reported on what the Lord is doing in the church. And so the AC Committee has helped to make that possible. And of course, judicial procedures. One of the things that we say to new folk in our congregation is that one of the great benefits that you have as a Presbyterian is that you are not limited to the wisdom of your local elders. If you think we're mistaken in some way, you have a right to appeal to the broader eldership and the presbytery. And if you think somehow they haven't seen or understood, you have a right to appeal to the whole church. Now, this is Christ's own provision for the good of the church in Matthew 18. And it's through the AC Committee that this is administered and funded and made possible. And it really is crucial to the purity and peace of the church. It is a Christ-honoring institution because so much of what Christ wants for the good of the order of our lives together comes through the labors of this committee. I'd say this, that in the debate about these proposals, we have amendments to the Book of Church Order. There have been criticisms of them. Now, I've had a fair amount of experience in amendments to the Book of Church Order. I've drafted a fair amount of material that's actually made its way in. I had the privilege of being part of drafting the huge change that we made in the way the General Assembly works a couple of years ago. I want to say this. The proposals before the church now are not perfect. No legislative drafting is perfect. You have your best shot at trying to accomplish what you think needs to be accomplished, but then you learn through practical experience how well adapted it is to work, and you make changes based on that experience. I think the way the assembly has been reordered has been very profitable to the church. But within a year, we recognized, when it actually was put into practice, that there were things we misjudged, that we didn't understand. So we came back and brought amendments, and that can be done. And that should be done here. We don't expect this to be a perfect policy, but we do expect that it is essentially sound and that we can correct it if we learn through experience there needs to be adjustments. So I don't think it's entirely fair to say that because it's not a perfect proposal, therefore it shouldn't be adopted at all. If that were the standard for anything in our polity, we'd in fact have no Book of Order at all.